And I make music boxes for all the children of the world. What you are listening to now is a special music box I created just for Fairyland. If you walk around my house, you will see murals showing how Grimm, the mean ogre of my homeland, Happy Valley, almost kept me from delivering this music box. Well, enjoy the music. Auf Wiedersehen.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromous. This is Burn Power, your friendly neighborhood Anadromous, coming to you from a nice overcast day here in Tbilisi. Not very cold. I like the overcast weather. I prefer it to the hot sun in the summer. And today what we're going to do is we're going to do something which is kind of coming to you as a prelude to my series on the cute and the creepy, but will end up being an addendum to the series. And what we're going to do is discuss fairy tales. Now, some people may be really excited about fairy tales for some reason and think, oh goody, Bern's going to go into all my favorites. No, I'm not. I have got a very specific goal in mind, and that is to show you that essentially fairy tales in the past were never cute. So I'm not going to be discussing the history of fairy tales or the psychology of fairy tales or the relationship of fairy tale, legend, and myth, which overlap. There is a point at which you suddenly find yourself sliding into Greek mythology or sliding off into the legends of history. It's very slippery ground for stories. And it's all kind of related. And I find it very fascinating. But today, we're going to keep our focus fairly narrow. And what I'm going to do is read you from some fairy tales from different sources. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to pause in the middle and point out certain things. So now, before we do this, I just want to remind you that if you are getting excited for the Cute and the Creepy series, which is coming up, and you should be, and you want to express that now, please hit like. Evidently, YouTube has changed its algorithms lately, and the more bells and whistles you punch, the better. I don't know how it really works. I don't think anybody knows how it really works, and YouTube is kind of mum about how they're actually doing it. But I've heard this from several creators that suddenly at the beginning of the year there was like a dip off on what they were doing. And I kind of noticed this myself. If I type in a phrase that is very specific to one of my videos, I don't find it unless I get a lot more specific. So one thing you can do to help is to like, share, subscribe, the usual suspects. If you want to know when the video is coming, hit the bell icon down below. It'll help. But, and if you wish, you can contribute to the channel, and that is appreciated. But let me show you a few of the books that I'm going to be using for our fairy tale discoveries today. So let me start off by showing you just some of the books of fairy tales and legends that I've been reading lately. And by lately, I mean the last 2-3 years. And I haven't been reading these straight through. I'm picking and just kind of, a title will interest me. I will go read it. The classic is going to be this one by the brothers Grimm. And this is an unabridged edition. And it's as close to the original as I could get not reading German. Now, in fact, in their lifetime, they put out several different editions. But I've chosen this one because it seemed to have, it's a nice leather-bound edition. And I recommend getting the best editions you can afford. Not editions that you can't afford to touch, but editions that look good on your shelf. And this didn't cost me too much. It was, about $20 or so. But the point of it is that you want an edition you can treasure. Why would you buy editions you can't treasure? In other words, don't buy cheap mass market paperback books ever if you can afford it, if you can avoid it at all. I can see just wanting to read something, but by the time you're done reading a mass market paperback, the book is pretty much done. So it's a waste of time and paper. Why are you reading books that you don't think you're going to need to keep? But we're going to spend a bit of time with old Grimm's fairy tales here. And the important point is that these were collected, not necessarily written, although sometimes maybe some aspects were added later, but they were collected in the late 18th century as part of the German Romantic movement and also part of the Grimm brothers' desire to promote the culture of a larger Germany. And so, but the importance for me is not that. The importance for me is that these are not at all what we would consider nice, child-friendly fairy tales, and we'll get into this. It's not the very opposite of Disney, in other words. Also, Hans Christian Andersen, I highly recommend getting a good edition. This is another leather-bound edition. Again, they're making leather-bound editions that are not very expensive now. Now, are these the best of all possible worlds? I think if you go to the Franklin Mint or something like that, you'll find better editions. Will you find better editions of these exact books? Maybe, maybe not. There's always many of them. This is a complete Hans Christian Andersen. And again, he's writing from the middle of the 19th century, and his work is a little different. It's still influenced by Romanticism, not quite as dark as the Grimm's brothers, but nevertheless, essential stuff. And I highly recommend it. Lots of little, and classics like Thumbelina, which shows up in different versions, but also, of course, the Little Mermaid and things like that. The Tinderbox, I love that. This is a book I've just gotten recently and haven't spent too much time with yet, and this is Irish Fairy Tales and Folklores by W.B. Yeats, which is essentially his rewriting of classic Irish folk and fairy tales, and I'm very interested in getting to that. So I still have much to get to, but I have spent time with this book. This may be the book that sent me on my recent, and it's only the recent edition of my interest in fairy tales. I have many more books back in Alaska that I'm trying to bring here, hint hint. But this is a book of Georgian folk traditions and legends. And this is quite interesting. I highly recommend it. Is it available where you live? Probably not. I've never checked for this on the large river-named source for books and such, or Abe Books or anything. I found this here, but lots of fascinating stuff. and especially about like the old gods and saints and things. Great, plenty of ideas, and also a good insight, a window into Georgian culture. I've actually had this idea for a short, not a short film, but an inexpensive film about this traditional goddess, Dali, who lives in the mountains. And I won't go into all of what I was thinking about that, but then someone said, well, don't film that in Svaneti. And I said, why? He says, they still believe in her there. And I said, ooh. I did get an edition of Perrault's Fairytales. I don't have the book jacket on here, because I hate book jackets. I like cloth textures. That's why I've gotten some better editions. I want texture on my wall. I don't want the flat, dead surfaces of the graphic design of. I mean, I accept this book in my collection because there isn't a hardback. If there were, I would not have that edition. I would have the hardback. And so this is an edition of Perrault's Fairytales, which are from the, I think the 17th century, yes, 17th century. The nice thing about this is it has the illustrations by a great American fantasy artist, Harry Clark. And he did things like Edgar Allan Poe. But the great thing about these is Little Red Riding Hood, Bluebeard. Ooh, that's a dark, dark story. And Beauty and the Beast. Yeah. So you've got some very interesting stuff here. Puss in Boots comes from this one. Actually, Beauty and the Beast isn't in this, and this is supposedly complete. I'll have to look into that a little bit more. But then I was in the Czech Republic earlier this year, and so I picked up books of Czech fairy tales, or Prague or Czech legends. I find that stories around the city of Prague are some of the most spooky tales you could possibly imagine. Headless people walking through the streets, strange buildings with curses on them, and just fascinating material. But we're not going to be reading any Czech fairy tales today. I'm still kind of going through all of these. Fortunately, they're very short little stories, and they make nice little nuggets to read here and there. My all-time fairy tale book, I have other books back in Alaska, but we'll just mention this one and stop. And for years, I have had the paperback edition of this book. Well, it's actually two books. It's George MacDonald's Gifts of the Child Christ. For years, I've had the paperback editions. I got the hardback edition. I've taken them out. Now I'm putting them back on my shelves so they look like this. Let's see if I get some light on there. Yeah, they look like that. And this has, for my money, George MacDonald, his fairy tales are the ultimate fairy tales. He was writing in the late 19th century, and he has a great essay in here, which we'll read from a little bit of, called The Fantastic Imagination. But he has stories in here like The Light Princess, The Wise Woman, the story of Photogen and Nycteris, and several others, The Carasoin and others, that are just absolutely haunting fairy tales and beautifully done. And sometimes in The Light Princess, kind of funny. But this one has what I consider the ultimate fairy tale, and that's The Golden Key. And The Golden Key is George MacDonald's, I don't know, it's the most cosmic fairy tale I've ever heard. Not cosmic in that hippy-dippy, trippy 60s sense, but cosmic, literally, you feel like you're opening a window into the gates of heaven. It's just fantastic. And I'm not going to explain much about that one today. Frankly, it's too good for you. And I don't want to give you a cheap rendition of it. But I will discuss it a little bit before we get out of here. So, there you are, my introduction to some of the books that have been inspiring me as I've gone through them to think more about the nature of fairy tales. But in today's video, what we're going to be discussing is how we're not going to go over a history of fairy tales, how they're collected, what are the best ones and all of that. What we're going to be really talking about is that fairy tales, the traditional fairy tales, are nothing like the fairy tales that people think they are today, as a result, largely, and first of all, because of the Disney Corporation and Walt Disney in the past, changed the nature of them. So that now we have a concept of the age-appropriate book, which I think is one of the most harmful concepts that has come and changed the nature of growing up as a child. So that, it comes down to us today as I remember going into a family where they had a laundry basket full of DVDs, all of these Disney type, and not all Disney, but Disney type movies. So much of it was little princesses who are going to achieve all this stuff. This has nothing to do with real fairy tales. This kind of idea that these stories are to promote empowerment and such like that. And that's what I'm going to show you today. Also, the figures in most of these movies, even Shrek, and certainly most of Disney and all the other different kinds of versions of fairy tales that we get given to us today, and children's stories, are all cute. And cute has nothing to do with real fairy tales, and that is what I'm going to be really discussing today. So, let's read a few selections from fairy tales and discuss them. As I am aging, I find myself needing reading glasses. My eyesight used to be perfect. What happened? Well, one thing I noticed is back in the late 90s, particularly around the year 2000, my eyesight was pretty good up till then, with a few glitches in the road. But the more time spent on computers, the worse my eyesight has gotten. If I can get an amen from somebody out there, that would be good. So I'm going to put on my reading glasses so I can read to you from a few books here. And we're going to start off with just a couple of paragraphs from The Gifts of the Child Christ, which was put out on the Eerdmans Company, I think it was about 1972, 73. It's still available. There are books of George MacDonald's fairy tales, but this, for my money, is the one that has them all in one place, and I would highly recommend it. I just found this hardback edition. It cost me about $50 to find it. I had the paperback for a while, but I've always been looking for the hardback edition, and often when I was searching, I wouldn't find it, but I finally found it. Having said that, any collection of George MacDonald's fairy tales is worth getting if you can't find this one. But paperback or hardback, look for either one. So, but, again, some of the great stories here. This is volume 1, and it's got the history of Photogen and Nycteris, which I highly recommend. Cross Purposes is great. The Wise Woman or The Lost Princess, a double story, is one of my absolute favorites. But The Golden Key, which we'll get a little bit of, shall we say, a small taste of at the end of this, is worth the whole book. And there is a Maurice Sendak version of just The Golden Key as a small little children's hardback book, which is worth everything. And that came out, I think, in the late 70s. The 70s was a good time for rediscovering these things. So, Not so much now. Now it's all political correctness and people don't know what to do with the real thing. But let's read from, he's got a great essay at the beginning of the book, and it's called The Fantastic Imagination. And you can tell when you start reading this that C.S. Lewis found this a long time ago. If you read it was really his introduction to the book Fairytales. C.S. Lewis talks about fairy tales in a certain way. Also Tolkien does as well. And guess which two people were really influenced by George MacDonald? If you read this essay, The Fantastic Imagination, which takes about 4 or 5 pages, you will suddenly understand Tolkien and Lewis and G.K. Chesterton much better, because they all read this. And this is what we would call an text, an original root text of, I would say, the modern approach to fairy tales. So let me read a bit of this. So, The Fantastic Imagination. This is the first couple of paragraphs. He says, that we have in English no word corresponding to the German Märchen, if I've said that correctly, it looks like Marchen. It drives us to use the word fairy tale, regardless of the fact that the tale may have nothing to do with any sort of fairy. The old use of the word fairy, by Spencer at least, might, however, be adduced, were justification or excuse necessary where need must. So in other words, he's saying that there was an older use of the word fairy, which you can find in Spencer's epic poem, The Fairy Queen, which was closer to the German word Märchen. And it's, we use the word fairy tale, but fairy tale is a very specific kind of thing. He goes on. Were I asked, what is a fairy tale? I should reply, read Undine, that is a fairy tale, then read this, then that as well, and you will see what is a fairy tale. Were I begged further to describe the fairy tale or define what it is, I would make answer that I should soonest think of describing the abstract human face or stating what must go to constitute a human being. A fairy tale is just a fairy tale, just as a face is just a face. And all fairy tales, as I know, and I think Undine, and of all fairy tales I know, I think Undine the most beautiful. Many a man, however, who would not attempt to define a man, might venture to say something as to what a man ought to be. Even so much I will not in this place venture with regard to the fairy tale, for my long past work in that kind might but poorly instance or illustrate my now more matured judgment. The natural world has its laws, and no man must interfere with them in the way of presentiment any more than in the way of use. But they themselves may suggest laws of other kinds. And man may, if he pleases, invent a little world of his own, with its own laws. For there is that in him which delights in calling up new forms, which is the nearest, perhaps, he can come to creation, when such forms are new embodiments of old truths. We call them products of the imagination. When they are mere inventions, however lovely, I should call them a work of fancy. In either case, law has to be diligently at work. And then he goes on to talk about what are some of the laws of fairy tales. In other words, if you invent something, you have to stay logical to it if you're creating a fairy tale. Essentially, he's talking about world construction here, that if you start with certain principles, you have to stay with those principles. And then he goes on and says, the moral world is different. There a man may clothe in new forms, for this employ his imagination freely, but he must invent nothing. He's talking about morality. You can't invent morality. He may not for any purpose turn its laws upside down. He must not meddle with the relationships of live souls. The laws of the spirit of man must hold alike in this world and in any world he may invent. It were no offense to suppose a world in which everything repelled instead of attracted the things around it. It would be wicked to write a tale representing a man called good as always doing bad things, or a man called bad who is always doing good things. The notion is itself absolutely lawless. In physical things, a man may invent. In moral things, he must obey and take their laws with him into the invented world as well. So, what he is saying is actually flies in the absolute contradiction to the idea of the self-defined self that we find today, where people are literally inverting morality in order to suggest that this is the way things should have been morally, and that in the past everything was wrong. What he's saying is, no, there are standards of morality, and as well as you know them, you can't simply invert them, even in your story, because it's going to violate something. Then he talks about questions that he sometimes gets, and he puts these in certain quotations. And he says, you write as if a fairy tale were a thing of importance, that it must have a meaning. And he replies, it cannot help having some meaning. And if it have proportion and harmony, it has vitality. Vitality is truth. The beauty may be plainer in it than the truth, but without the truth, the beauty could not be, and the fairy tale would have no delight. Everyone, however, who feels the story will read its meaning after his own nature and development. One man may read one thing in it, another will read another. And he goes on to talk about, essentially, fairy tales are works of art. And in a good work of art, it doesn't just mean one simple thing. Every person who approaches it will read it differently according to their own, what they understand about life. And he's talking essentially about symbols here. The symbols, he says, someone will say, suppose my child asks me what the fairy tale means. What am I supposed to say? And he says, if you do not know what it means, what is easier than to say so? If you do see a meaning in it, there it is for you to give him. A genuine work of art must mean many things. The truer its art, the more things it will mean. If my drawing, on the other hand, is so far from being a work of art that it needs, this is a horse, written under it, what can it matter that neither you nor the child should know what it means? So, essentially, and he goes on to talk about, he's talking about the symbols in art. And if anything, George MacDonald is a master of symbolism. And he says, a fairy tale is not an allegory. And if you remember from my symbolism videos, which I would suggest looking for if you haven't, he says they may be allegory. An allegory is really when the symbol points to something direct. So, Aslan in the Chronicles of Narnia is Jesus, is an allegory. Although, I would also say, C.S. Lewis was better than that, so Aslan is also a lion. That is to say, with a full symbolic weight of a lion. And so C.S. Lewis wasn't simply writing an allegory. But he says there may be allegory in it, but it is not an allegory. He must be an artist indeed who can, in any mode, produce a strict allegory that is not a weariness to the spirit. So, interestingly enough, this obviously is where Tolkien got his ideas about allegory. And Tolkien hated allegory as much as he loved George MacDonald's work. Because when you read George MacDonald's work, these things don't just mean a thing. Like he has the three wise men in the golden, or the three, you could call them three wise men in the golden key. And you read that, and there's one part of you going, oh, is this the Trinity? But then there's another part of you that's, it's like, you can feel if you're sensitive to it, you can feel the hair standing up in the back of your neck, because it's so incredible what he is showing you. And it almost can't be described in any other words but the words he uses to show you what he's showing you. So it's very complex. But Tolkien and Lewis had a big fallout over this. And Tolkien just hated allegory. And he did not consider his work to be allegorical at all. And when people would try to say, well, the rings of power are the nuclear bomb, he was just like, no, that's not what I started coming up with this concept before there was such an idea. So, but people like to impose this kind of allegorical approach on things, that this equals that. And some people will say, well, that's symbolism. And I say, no, it's not. That's just one layer of symbolism. And there is allegory, and allegory is a very specific kind of symbolism. But what he's saying here is that if a person does make allegory, he needs to be a kind of an artist who can, in any mode, produce a strict allegory that is not weariness to the spirit. Because it's so easy, once you find the key to the allegory, you're going like, oh, okay, this is that, and that's this, and this is that. And that's too simplistic by far. Well, anyway, I'm going to stop reading from this right now, and we are going to move on. What I want to show you by reading you some of these old fairy tales, and I'm not reading them to give you the auditory experience of hearing fairy tales. That is to say, reading a fairy tale to a group of people or to a child is one thing. What I'm doing is I'm trying to elucidate certain aspects of the fairy tale which have almost nothing to do with the way that people, especially around children, tell stories today. And what I also want to show you is that the traditional fairy tale is far superior to today's children's literature, today's films, today's most of what we do today. Because I think one of the few people who can make a fairy tale the way they should be made is Guillermo del Toro. And he doesn't do it all the time. Every now and then he lets his, political ideas seep into the text. But, for instance, Pan's Labyrinth, I would say, is an absolutely fantastic fairy tale-like story. And it does deal with certain kinds of political things as far as Spain goes. But when you see the figures he uses in there, you get that real sense of a fairy tale. And I think Guillermo del Toro, at his best, is a man who really understands fairy tales. When he's not too, in love with Godzilla, and, he's got other aspects to his personality. But in something like Pan's Labyrinth, and I'm really curious to see his animated Pinocchio when it comes out, he is on a different level. He's one of the few people who really understands it. Much more so than someone who's more popular, and that's Tim Burton. Tim Burton can't make a fairy tale without the ironic spin. And the ironic spin, to me, kills the depth of the fairy tale. It makes it funny. It makes it the kind of thing you go like, oh, that's great. And I love Tim Burton movies. I've never seen a Tim Burton movie that I didn't enjoy on some level. But I don't find the depth there. And I would say that Pan's Labyrinth wipes out all the Tim Burton movies as far as meaning goes, because it's got so much more. Not that you can compare one artist to another. But we're just going to look at a moment from Perrault's fairy tales here. And of course, a story we all know, and you probably know the ending of this one. Little Red Riding Hood. And, of course, it's the story of the girl who goes to see her grandmother with the wolf. Actually, what does the wolf do to the grandmother? Nothing savory. And then ends up getting into the bed with the grandmother's night clothes. What happens? Well, we have the famous lines, "Grandmama, what great arms you have," Little Red Riding Hood says to the wolf who's pretending to be the grandmother, and says, "That's the better to hug thee, my dear. Grandmama, what great legs you have. That is to run the better, my child. Grandmama, what great ears you've got. That's to hear better, my child. Grandmama, what great eyes you've got. That's to see better, my child. Grandmama, what great teeth you've got. That is to eat thee up." And here, Little Red Riding Hood is not rescued by hunters. And in saying these words, the wicked wolf fell upon poor Little Red Riding Hood and ate her all up. And just to make it plain what he's talking about, Perrault basically has a moral at the end of the story. He says from this short story, and you can imagine some French nobleman. I imagine someone in the court of Louis XIV, wearing a wig and finery, and saying, "From this short story, easy we discern what conduct all young people ought to learn." Oh, it's in poetry. That's why I was fumbling over it. "But above all, young and growing Mrs. Fair, whose orient rosy blooms begin to appear," in other words, she is maturing, "whose beauty in the fragrant spring of age, with pretty airs young hearts are apt to engage, I'll do they listen to all sorts of tongues, since some encant and lure like sirens' songs. No wonder therefore 'tis, if overpowered, so many of them has the wolf devoured." Do you get what he's doing there? He's preparing the girls for the reality of men and sex. And here's what's really strange. We would look at that today. I mean, how many people are actually reading that version of Little Red Riding Hood to their children? Few, I would think, today. Certainly not. This is as an original version as I could find. And here's the point. We are afraid of telling our children, preparing them for the world. This fairy tale is really preparing the child for the world, especially the young girl. And which is why it's been retold in so many different ways as a story. But we get squeamish, especially now. People are very squeamish about age-appropriate things, Byrne. What about age-appropriate? Which is a term I absolutely hate. Because what is age-appropriate? It should be your child-appropriate, because you should know your child well enough to know what level they're reading at. And you should be getting them to read more and more. And you should read to them, and you should read to them things a bit more complicated than they are, to get them to jump up and learn more. But while people are getting squeamish about all of these things today, there is a new squeam factor at work in our world today, both on the left and the right. And everyone wants to protect the children, which, of course, what's wrong with protecting the children? What's wrong is if you don't prepare them for the world. That's what's wrong. And in a world where essentially the devouring mother has come to the fore, and the father has been pushed aside as essentially we're fearful of his toxicity, whatever that means. The person who should really be introducing the child to the world, the father, has essentially, the man has been left in front of the television set or the computer screen with his beer and his porn, or his game, whatever. And so he's not introducing the child to the world the way this fairy tale would be. This is a fairy tale for a father to read to his children. So what happens instead is, who introduces the child to the realm of sex? Well, it's the whisperings of the children at school who tell them about what the things you can see on the internet. That's who does it. So what would you rather have? That's how dark fairy tales get. But the point is this. Now, there's another one in here that's very important. And it's also along the same lines. And it's much darker, and it is Bluebeard. Now, Bluebeard is so dark, and it's kind of along the Beauty and the Beast lines. But it's the Beauty and the Beast where there is not a beautiful soul under the beast. Rather, the woman comes to live as a bride to a man, and he tells her, you can go anywhere in my castle, but don't go to the one room. Why have we not seen a version of this as a cartoon, I wonder? It's because what's in the room are the the severed heads and the bodies of his previous brides. Oh. It's like, oh, that's a story. And interestingly enough, the late English author Angela Carter, retold this story and called it The Bloody Chamber. And she has a book collection which I suggest to you, if you have courage, to read, because this is her retelling of many of these old fairy tales, but pulling out all of the underlying subtext, and so you see what's in the room in her book, and it's called The Bloody Chamber and Other Tales, and The Bloody Chamber is Bluebeard, and in this one again, it's just dark. Dear old Parole ends up, "O curiosity, thou mortal bane, spite of thy charm, thou causest often pain." And so he's talking about, the temptations of curiosity. And this is a severe warning. Now, someone could say, oh, it's a man trying to put women in his place. To which I would say, oh, how naive you are. I've been to the Port Authority bus terminal and seen a 13-year-old girl trying to talk to a 60-year-old man to get him to go with her for a encounter, shall we say, knowing that if I cast my eyes around a little further, I'm also going to see the person watching her who is the predator. And if a person gets to the age of 18 before, at least in my country, America, they are introduced to the world and does not understand the concept of human predators, sociopathy, psychopathy, if they don't understand that there are people who are prey, and if they just have, in Alaska, they would have these valedictorian speeches, and they're always, you're going out into the world, and for the high school students, and then they would invite some local figure to get up and give a speech to the children, and they'd always talk about, you have to work hard, and if you just put your mind to it, you can accomplish whatever you have set yourself to accomplish. As if that person's life had become anything like what they were really imagining it to be. Because whose life ends up being exactly like you imagine it to be? No one's. But I often thought, if they ever asked me to do this, which they never did, but a couple of times I did go speak at the school, so it was within the realm of possibility. I often thought the first thing I would say to them is, you know what? You've been lied to for the last, so many years of your school education. You've been told you can do anything. Whereas what you really need to know is how to go on after you've hit the wall, after you've hit failure, after you have made stupid choices, after things have fallen down on you, after you have discovered darkness. That's what they really should be telling you. And that is what fairy tales are telling you. So again, interestingly, we have a Beauty and the Beast cartoon movie by Disney, and we've never had a Bluebeard movie. Because that's like too real. Let me mention Hans Christian Andersen now. And especially I just want to, the most famous story probably for our generation is The Little Mermaid. Although I really love the tinderbox with the 3 weird dogs with big eyes. And that's one thing you find often in fairy tales is you find these weird duplication of events. I was just reading a Czech fairy tale where this man on a horse comes up to like a wounded cat on the side of the road, and then he helps the cat, and the cat it runs off and says, remember me though when you're in trouble. And he fixes a wounded eagle and he goes, remember me when you're in trouble. And he does this 3 or 4 times. And it's the duplication of things like in the tinderbox where you get each dog slightly bigger than the last. I find that an interesting principle because in life one does repeat things, and it's important to understand. So, Little Mermaid, I'm sure many of you have seen the Disney movie. I have a collection of various versions of it. But here is the most important fact. In The Little Mermaid, it does not work out in the end. In the end, she's in tears, which she's not supposed to be, which means she's grown, but she sees the man she fell in love with his new bride, and they go off into the sunset. Interestingly enough, the spirits from on high say to the Little Mermaid, this is the way that we shall rise to the kingdom of God after 300 years have passed. We may even get there sooner, one spirit whispered. Unseen, we fly into the homes of men, where there are children. And for every day which we find a good child who pleases his parents and deserves their love, God shortens the days of our trial. The child does not know when we float through the room. But if we see a naughty, mischievous child, we must shed tears of sorrow for the child, and each tear adds a day to the time of our trial. The point is this. The Little Mermaid is not the Disney story. It is darker. It doesn't work out in the end, in the way that, and everything resolves. It is, in fact, a very different beast indeed. So, at this point, I'd like to read from, I'm going to spend more time with the brothers Grimm. And I want to read for you just a little bit from some of their lesser-known fairy tales. Rumpelstiltskin, Rapunzel, Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel are all here, and the versions are different. For instance, in Rumpelstiltskin, the Rumpelstiltskin man literally tears himself in half at the end. That's, again, the kind of thing that we don't necessarily like in our stories. Also, Sleeping Beauty is in here. Sleeping Beauty is also in Pearl, and There's often more than one source for many of these stories, which is great. Let me start with a little story called The Singing Bone. Now, one thing I also want to show you is that these stories don't follow our rules at all for telling a story. They did not take a course on how to write a screenplay or how to write a story. In a certain country, there was once a great lamentation over a wild boar that ravaged the farmers' fields and killed the cattle and ripped up people's bodies with tusks. We're already dealing with a dark world here. The king promised a large reward to anyone who would free the land from this plague. But the beast was so big and strong that no one dared to go near the forest in which it lived. At last, the king gave notice that whoever should capture or kill the wild boar should have his only daughter as a wife. Now, at this point, you are saying to yourself, if you're thinking like a contemporary person, anyone say after World War II, you're thinking to yourself, so now I know how this story is going to go. There's going to be a guy who comes along, slays the beast, and gets the daughter for a wife. And there'll be some bit of trials and tribulations. And you'll be told that that is how a good story goes. It's going to be some variation on the hero's journey or something like this. This is one reason I always find the hero's journey to be applicable now and then, but usually not. Because I think, like for instance, in Fairytales, they avoid the hero's journey like the plague. It's almost like they said, oh, Joseph Campbell said that, we're not going to say that. Observe. Now, there lived in the country two brothers. It's kind of Cain and Abel, isn't it? Or we will see if it's going to be Cain and Abel. Sons of a poor man, who declared themselves willing to undertake the hazardous enterprise. The elder, who was crafty and shrewd out of pride, the younger, who was innocent and simple from a kind heart. So, essentially, he's set up a dichotomy here. And I think anyone who originally heard this story would immediately be thinking Cain and Abel. Because Cain and Abel is foundational. We, however, are saying to ourselves, again, hero's journey. The younger brother, who's obviously the good brother, is going to go through troubles, but will eventually triumph. The king said, in order to be sure of finding the beast, you must go into the forest from opposite sides. That's a very interesting observation. So the elder went in on the west side, and the younger went in on the east, which also means the elder is traveling east, and the younger is traveling west. And west is often the direction of truth. So, when the younger had gone a short way, a little man stepped up to him, held up in his hand a black spear and said, I will give you the spear because your heart is pure and good, and you can boldly attack the wild boar, and it will do you no harm. He thanked the little man. Who is the little man, by the way? We don't know. It's just this mysterious figure in the woods. Shouldered the spear and went on fearlessly. Before long he saw the beast, which rushed at him, but he held the spear towards it, and in its blind fury it ran so swiftly against it that its heart was cut in two. So the beast just ran towards him. He held the spear there, and it cut straight into the heart of the boar. And by the way, boars are not some little creature. They are big. They can be long as I am. I mean, you can see I have a massive beast here. He then took the monster on his back and went home with it to the king. As he came out on the other side of the wood, there stood at the entrance a house where people were making merry with wine and dancing. His elder brother had gone in there. And now we have echoes of the prodigal son story, where the son goes out and squanders his father's living. But interestingly enough, it's reversed from the story in the Bible, where it's the older brother who stays behind and just works for his father, and the younger brother who wastes his money. So, his elder brother had gone in here and thinking that after all the boar would not run away, it's like the boar is going to be there for a while, he was going to drink until he felt brave. So he's going to drink until he felt brave. Well, what's really going to happen is he's going to drink until he gets drunk, and he's not going to feel brave at all. But when he saw his younger brother coming out of the wood, laden with his booty, his boar, his envious, evil heart gave him no peace. He called out to him, "Come in here, dear brother, rest and refresh yourself with a cup of wine." The youth, who suspected no evil, went in and told him about the good little man who'd given him the spear with which he had slain the boar. That's an interesting story, isn't it? But the younger brother, has a big fault. He suspects no one of evil, especially not his brother. He is a fool at this point. The elder brother kept him there until evening, and when they went away together, when in the darkness they came to a bridge over the brook, the elder brother let the other go first, and when he was halfway across, gave him such a blow from behind that he fell dead. Uh-oh. So much for the hero's journey. It is more Cain and Abel. He buried him beneath the bridge, took the boar, carried it to the king, pretending that he had killed it, whereupon he obtained the king's daughter in marriage. And when his younger brother did not come back, he said, "The boar must have killed him," and everyone believed it. But as nothing remains hidden from God, this black deed was to come to light. Years afterwards, a shepherd was driving his herd across the bridge and saw, lying in the sand beneath, a snow-white little bone. He thought that it would make a good mouthpiece, so he clambered down, picked it up, and cut it out of it a mouthpiece for his horn. So a shepherd is blowing a horn, makes a mouthpiece out of the bone of the brother. Did you see this coming? And when he blew through it, but when he blew through it for the first time, to his great astonishment, the bone began of its own accord to sing, "Ah, friend, you blow upon my bone. Long have I lain beside the water. My brother slew me for a boar, and took for his wife the king's young daughter." "What a wonderful horn," said the shepherd. "It sings by itself. I must take it to the king." And when he came with it to the king, the horn began to sing its little song, and the king understood it all, and ordered the ground below the bridge to be dug up, and there the whole skeleton of the murdered man came to light. The wicked brother could not deny the deed, and was sewn into a sack and drowned. But the bones of the murdered man were laid to rest in a beautiful tomb in the churchyard. Yeah, we're far away. You know what? We just wandered into horror territory, which I think is really, really fascinating. Okay, let me read you from another fairy tale. I'm not going to tell you the name of this fairy tale, because the name of the fairy tale immediately would tell you how weird this is going to get. But it starts off like this. A certain miller had little by little fallen into poverty and had nothing left but his mill and a large apple tree behind it. And once, when he had gone into the forest to fetch wood, an old man stepped up to him, whom he had never seen before, and said, "Why do you plague yourself with cutting wood? I will make you rich, if you will promise me what is standing behind your mill." "What can that be but my apple tree?" thought the miller, and said yes, and gave a written promise to the stranger. He, however, laughed mockingly and said, "When 3 years have passed, I will come and carry away what belongs to me." And then he went. Now, this is warning you very seriously of something, quite clearly. Is what's behind the mill, really, that this rather demonic person already knows. When the miller got home, his wife came to meet him and said, "Tell me, miller, from where comes this sudden wealth into our house?" And all at once every box and chest was filled. No one brought it in, and I know not how it happened. And he answered, "It comes from a stranger who met me in the forest and promised me great treasure. I, in return, have promised him what stands behind the mill. We can very well give him the big apple tree for it." "Oh, husband," said the terrified wife, "that must have been the devil. He did not mean the apple tree, but our daughter, who was standing behind the mill, sweeping the yard." The miller's daughter was beautiful, a God-fearing girl, and lived through 3 years in piety without sin. Now, it becomes clearer later in the story, I'm not going to read every word here, that she is also pretty much of marriageable age. She's an older teenager, and in 3 years she's going to be just fine for being a marriage partner. When, therefore, the time was over, the day came when the evil one, E and O are capitalized here, was to fetch her. And of course, these are originally in German, so these are always translations. She washed herself clean, made a circle around herself with chalk. She's trying to ward off the devil with some sort of spell or, something like that. I'm not sure of the full significance of that, although I've seen it quite a few times in horror films. The devil appeared quite early, but he could not come near her. She's protected herself. Angrily, he said to the miller, "Take all the water away from her, that she may no longer be able to wash herself, for otherwise I will have no power over her." The miller was afraid and did so. The next morning, the devil came again, but she had wept on her hands, and they were quite clean. Again, he could not get near her. Evidently, the devil wants you to be dirty. And they were quite clean. Again, he could not get near her. Furiously, he said to the miller, "Cut off her hands, or else I cannot get the better of her." The miller was shocked and answered, "How could I cut off my own child's hands?" Then the evil one threatened and said, "If you do not do it, you are mine, and I will take you." Now at this point, the father is being given a very serious choice. And essentially the fairy tale is saying, what would you do in the event of a terrible choice between losing your own life and giving your daughter to the devil? So the father became alarmed and promised to obey him. So he went to the girl and said, "My child, if I do not cut off both your hands, the devil will carry me away, and in my terror I have promised to do it. Help me in my need and forgive me the harm I do you." Dad's got some problems, evidently. And in a sense, this is warning any child who hears this that your parents are not perfect, which is an important thing to learn. And she replied, "Dear father, do with me what you will. I am your child." She is essentially a saint. Thereupon she laid down both her hands and let them be cut off, and the devil came for the third time, but she had wept so long and so much on the stumps that after all they were quite clean. And then he had to give in and lost all right to her. Interestingly enough, he can only come to her 3 times, which is something that the people telling the story understood, and we don't. That is to say, it's not part of our common understanding. The miller said to her, "Because you have received such great wealth, that I will keep you most delicately as long as you live." So the father's going to protect her. He says, "Because of you I have received such great wealth." Because essentially, because of his daughter, he received the money. But she replied, and here she's like confronting him with the truth of his actions. She's saying, "Here I cannot stay. I will go forth. Compassionate people will give me as much as I require." And listen to this. Thereupon she had her maimed arms bound to her back, and by sunrise she set out on her way, walking the whole day and night until night fell. And then she came to, so she had her maimed arms bound to her back. Just picture that in your mind for a minute. That her arms are essentially tied to her back so that no one sees them as she's walking. Maybe she had a cape on. It doesn't fully explain. Then she came to a royal garden, and by the shimmering of the moon she saw that the trees covered with beautiful fruits that grew in it, but she could not enter, for there was as much water around it. And as she had walked the whole day and not eaten one mouthful, and hunger tormented her, she thought, "Ah, if I were but inside, then I might eat the fruit, or else I must die of hunger." And then she knelt down and called on God the Lord and prayed, and suddenly an angel came to her, who made a dam in the water so that the moat became dry and she could walk through it. And now she went into the garden, and the angel went with her. This kind of harkens back to Moses and the Red Sea a bit. She saw a tree covered with beautiful pears, but they were all counted. Someone knows how many pears that they have on the tree. Then she went to them to still her hunger, ate one with her mouth from the tree, but no more. The gardener was watching, but as the angel was standing by, he was afraid and thought the maiden was a spirit and was silent. And to make a long story short, the king comes out and basically says, "Where are my pears?" Oh, there's one missing. And the gardener explains, and then he eventually meets the girl, but realizes she is this very purified creature. Through her suffering and pain, has been purified. And the king takes her in, but he recognizes her beauty, even though she is damaged extremely. And he ends up marrying her, and she becomes the queen. And eventually, she invites her father back to them. And without going into the whole story, which you really should read yourself, eventually what happens is her arms are restored to her through an act of grace that she performs for someone else, that she becomes, again, she is very much a saint in this. Now, why is it we don't see stories like this being made into movies and such? And I would say part of the reason is it's dark. The imagery is dark. And again, it's much more fit for a horror story. Except that unlike a horror story, the main point of the story is not to scare you. Or this isn't even a warning, although if you're the father, it certainly is a warning. But rather it is saying something very deep. But the imagery of an armless girl wandering around with her arms tied up is a very spooky imagery. It's very resonant imagery as well. It's very potent symbolic imagery. And what's it potent of symbolic for? Apart from being damaged, you can read a lot into that. What are hands? Why would the hands be cut off? And how does that relate to the devil? And all of these things, and the cleaning. You could just go on and on and on. That is not my point to symbolically interpret all of this for you, because I think you should just go ahead and read it. But I think that the point that I'm trying to make is that we don't want to see these things today. We want to present children with a perfect world, or a world where they can easily, way too easily, overcome the problems of the world. And so, to make a story in our world today where the child in the story actually has their arms cut off, their hands cut off, is too disturbing for us. And yet, we live in a world where essentially, by not having these darker lessons taught to us, by in a sense poo-pooing them as being primitive or something, we are facing, why are there drug epidemics? Why is there pornography so prevalent? Why is there just rampant commercial greed, for lust for things? Why does everyone try to present themselves on their social media platforms as being a certain thing? I was just thinking about this idea of representation, because you hear that all the time today. People are, we want to see representation of minority characters or gay characters in films. And I thought to myself, people used to not represent themselves that way. They used to not think about presenting images of themselves to people in that kind of a way. That's something very new. You go way back to the beginning of photography, for instance, and people sat there very seriously. Now, that's how they represented themselves. But it wasn't representation in the way we think of it today. Because in the past, people just were. They didn't need to represent who they were, because there weren't millions and millions of people consuming their images. If you had a photo taken, it was just for the family. You didn't expect anybody else to see it, and it was just as a commemorative, and you didn't get many taken, in the 19th century. You didn't have lots of photos taken of yourself unless you were Abraham Lincoln, and even then, I would say Abraham Lincoln probably had as many photos taken of him in his lifetime that you do on one day on a vacation. People didn't present themselves that way. They didn't have to represent themselves as if, and we use the word agency, which I find, increasingly I'm finding this a weird word, because it's just like agency. Well, it does relate to like the agency of a film star or a music star, your management, the people who were, it's just like, hey, can I get in touch with Burn Power, and who's his agent? Who represents him? And representation is not you. I don't what I'm doing here is not my representation. It's as much as possible, it's me. Because I think that presenting any image of me, perfect image of me, would do damage to who I am. Now, there's a lot of pros and cons about that. But it's quite clear that no one was representing themselves in these stories. Except in, who's the rich son, who's the poor son. But even then, people are making mistakes. The poor son, the young son who was the noble son in this poor family who went and killed the boar, was actually naive and stupid because he trusted his brother. He somehow had no idea who his brother was, and was happy to sit and drink all day with him, and then get drunk, that's implied, and have his head bashed in by his greedy brother. So he may have been a better person, but he wasn't smarter. Here's a weird one. This is a very short story, and I'm going to end with this one. It's called The Aged Mother. By the way, the name of that last story I read you was called The Girl with No Hands. That kind of gives the game away. But this one's called The Aged Mother. And again, think of this in terms of the way stories are told to us today and what you're expecting to happen. In a large town, there was an old woman who sat in the evening alone in her room, thinking how she had lost her first husband, then both her children, and then one by one all her relationships, and at length, that very day, her last friend. And now she was quite alone and desolate. This is dark. This is just someone who's alone, has lost everyone in her life. And you know what? This happens to people. So, we continue on. And I think it's going to happen more as we enter this world of media isolation. She was very sad at heart, and heaviest of all her losses was that of her sons. And in her pain, she blamed God for it. So that's another aspect that you find in pretty much all these old fairy tales. They all have morals. They all know there's a God. There's no doubt about this in Hans Christian Andersen or in all the Grimm stories, or even Perrault. It's very clear there is an order to the universe. And she was still sitting, lost in thought, when all at once she heard the bells ringing for early prayer. So, now she's heard the bells. Now the bells obviously symbolize something spiritual is going to happen. It's a call. And it's a call, in this case, to the church. She was surprised that she had thus in her sorrow watched through the whole night and lighted her lantern and went to the church. And it was already lit up when she arrived, but not as it usually was with wax candles, but with a dim light. So there's a light glowing from within. Now, at this point, you're saying, oh, is she going to die? Is she going to meet her? What's going to happen? There's a light. Is she going to meet God? What's going to happen? It was also crowded already with people, and all the seats were filled. And when the old woman got to her usual place, it also was not empty, but the whole bench was entirely full. And when she looked at the people, there were none other than her dead relations who were sitting there in old-fashioned garments, but with pale faces. But they neither spoke nor sang, but a soft humming whisper was heard all over the church. And to us, this suggests the end of her life. It suggests a resolution at the end. It suggests that it's going to be a moment of epiphany, that she's going to look around and she's going to think of all the meaning of her family. Because we're conditioned to happy endings. Then an aunt of hers stood up, stepped forward, and said to the poor old woman, "Look there, beside the altar, and you will see your sons." The modern person, used to the kind of sentimental versions of fairy tales that we get, is immediately going, "Oh, her sons are there." The old woman looked there and saw her two children, one hanging on the gallows, the other bound to a wheel. And by bound to the wheel, they mean the wheel is set like a table, and he's probably tied to his back on it. Basically, they're both being tortured. And then the aunt said, "You see, this is how it would have been with them if they had lived. And if the good God had not taken them to himself when they were innocent children." The old woman went trembling home on her knees and thanked God for having dealt with her more kindly than she had been able to understand. And on the third day she lay down and died. I mean, talk about dark. I mean, basically the woman has shown that her children, and probably due to her raising of them in some weird way, would have ended up essentially as criminals of some sort. And you should be grateful that they died when they did. And I'm sure a lot of children died young. But this is, anyone who thinks these fairy tales are like something for little children don't understand. However, I think if you can read some of these to little children, or young children, or even young teens, in a family sort of setting, I think you can communicate great truths. Because you see the way that built up? It was just like, she's sad, and then there's a church, and it's filled with light, and all her relatives are there, and then her sons are there, and then bam! I mean, again, it's very similar to a horror story. And I think this is one of the reasons I like horror movies and such, is because they will often tell you true things that we can't say to each other directly, because essentially we have lost this culture. We have lost a culture where there were warnings like this. Instead, we were worried more about representation, about self-representation, about whether we're expressing agency or not. Well, if you're not worried about expressing agency, you're probably expressing agency. You know, and if you're not worried about representation, you're probably representing yourself fairly well. That's the problem, is people are so... I find that when everyone starts talking about uses certain words at a certain time, it's like in the 60s, they were talking about love all the time. And then love ended up essentially being crucified on just the expansion of the term, and then its relation, putting it too closely to lust as part of what love was. Just as now I think we're using the word agency, and you hear it all over. I hear this word all over. 5 years ago I hardly ever heard this word. Now I'm hearing it all the time. Which tells me our agency is being stripped away from us by the day and being replaced with, something else. Captivity, I would say, would probably be what it's really being stripped with. So, just a final mention before I go. Again, do you get what I'm saying? Fairy tales in the past were not cute. And our cutified fairy tales do us a great disservice. They do not prepare us for the world. They tell us a world where everything is possible, a world where people aren't really filled with dark motivations. Whereas these stories, I'm just reading these few little stories, I'm immediately told, oh, anything can happen. Not everything that's going to happen is good. You need to be prepared. You need to be a good person. You need to gather your arms, be ready for the fight. You need to be a trustworthy person. You need to be aware. But in a cute version of these stories, what often is told, and I think Disney is the worst culprit of this, and I think girls are the primary target, is you need to be told that you're a princess and everything is going to work out. And no matter what happens, it's going to be Beauty and the Beast, it's going to be The Little Mermaid, it's going to be, Moana, it's going to be, if you don't get the man or the partner, to use the more prosaic and ridiculous term. Why is everyone suddenly partners again? That you're going to be empowered at least. And don't get me started on the word empowered, says Mr. Power. But my all-time favorite fairy tale is George MacDonald's The Golden Key, which I am not going to read for you right now, or even part of it, because it is so beautiful and intense. And it deals with life, and it deals with death. And it is obviously a man who has worked his way through the meaning of mythology, and the meaning of fairy tales, and the meaning of legends. And the Golden Key is like a distillation. It is filled with strange images, like a flying fish, the silhouettes of human beings on the panorama of the world, on the silhouette of the sky. It's filled with, at one point there's a baby putting marbles into the air as if they were DNA strands or subatomic particles. And this is written in the 1880s or so. There are images, there's an old man who's not old at all. There are two children, and as they go through this short story on this specific quest, they age, each of them ages until they're old by the end of it. So literally in the story, only a couple of Days seem to have passed, 2-3 days, and yet from the beginning of the story to the end, they become old. Just fascinating stuff. And so I suggest looking for, if you want the pinnacle of fairy tales, find the fairy tales of George MacDonald. But don't omit these other fairy tales if you like fairy tales at all. And you should. And that doesn't mean that everyone should have had fairy tales read to them as a child, good fairy tales. And it doesn't mean that everyone should like them. Some people like more practical, realistic-oriented matter, where it's about, daily life kind of things, or daily life in the past. Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, that kind of thing. And I had Huckleberry Finn read to me at school when I was young, and complete, unedited. We had a teacher who would read these things we'd have a certain period during the day where we'd sit, and over a course of months we would hear the whole Huckleberry Finn. You spend 25 minutes on a chapter or something like that. And we loved it. But fairy tales, I want to say two things. Read them and find the versions that are the most authentic, that haven't been tampered with to make them adjusted to modern sensibilities. And then you will learn something. Okay, I'm done. This was a bit longer than I thought it was going to be. And I want to thank you for spending your time here on the Anadromous. Remember, Anadromous describes fish swimming back up against the stream to go home to spawn, to go home to die. But basically, to go home. Be an Anadromous. Go against the stream. Don't be like other people. As G.K. Chesterton once said, only a dead thing floats down with the stream. Only a living thing can swim against it. Be the living thing in this time where we're being encapsulated by technology, by just imagery that is so dead and sterile, by propaganda feeding into your head like worms. I realize more and more, even a lot of the people that I have respected listening to on YouTube, how many of them have to give in to propaganda at certain points? And I hope never to do that myself. So I try to keep things. You'll notice I don't have a set of words I use all the time. And I do that on purpose. And I feel you don't really understand something until you learn to use your own language to explain it. So learn what it means and then find your own words to explain it to someone else. Okay, as the Georgians say, droabit, which means temporarily, just for a little while. We'll meet again.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.